Hello everyone, Mariko here.
And Kiyomi.
And we're both residential realtors with the Bridgewell Real Estate Group. Thank you for coming back to the Bridgewell Group vlog where we talk about all things real estate, specifically in the Greater Vancouver area. And today's real estate topic is going to be about pre-sales, and specifically pre-sale frequently asked questions. So it's going to be a great one.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of people come in not really understanding the difference between pre-sale versus
100%.
resale, so they have a lot of questions regarding it, especially like, what's the major difference between pre-sale versus resale? What are the different taxes, deposit schemes, like things like that?
Yeah, completion, rescission, everything. There's a lot of key differences, and the pre-sale world is completely different. There's a lot of realtors that actually don't even do both resale and pre-sale. So we're here to really break down those differences between pre-sale and resale, but also get into those specific pre-sale FAQs. So let's just get into it.
So starting off, I think one of the really big major questions that we get asked a lot is, what is a pre-sale versus resale property?
Definitely. And when you're looking at these differences, I think it's first important to note just what the definitions of each are. And I think that the key defining things for pre-sale versus resale is that pre-sale is generally sold by a developer. It's generally not a tangible asset that you can see or feel right now. Like most of the time it's not built yet. So you are walking through a show home or a presentation center. They may not have your exact floor plan. So it's more of just an idea of what will be built in the future. Completions can be really long. And as I said, they're generally pre-sold. So pre-sold prior to it actually completing. On the resale side of things, kind of also in the nature of its name, it's a resale. So it's not sold by a developer. It's sold by somebody that's already owned it as an original owner, or maybe an owner down the road, whether that be the second, third, fourth, etc. owner. It is a tangible asset. It's something you can walk through. It's something that's built. You know exactly what you're getting. You know exactly what the condition is, all of that, the direction facing, etc., etc. You can actually walk through it. And the completion times are generally a lot quicker just because it's already been built. So that's really the main definition between pre-sale and resale, and kind of those defining factors into figuring out whether you are buying a pre-sale or
versus resale. Yeah, I do think it's important to note though that there are some cases where you have move-in ready homes with a pre-sale development. So in some cases the developer may not have sold out of all their units yet, or maybe they've kind of held back some of the properties to sell once the project is actually completed. So yeah, there are definitely cases where there are move-in ready homes, but you'll still kind of know that it is that pre-sale property because of the fact that it's still being sold by the developer themselves.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And on that note as well, I mean, there's a lot of other differences. I would say a big one is taxes. You almost always know whether something is a pre-sale if you have to pay the 5% GST.
Yeah.
And so that's a big one is with pre-sales, you have to pay that 5% GST. But there's also differences in property transfer tax, exemptions, all that. Differences in completion, differences in deposits. And so we've actually done a whole other video on this, breaking down the pre-sale versus resale key differences. So we'll definitely leave a link to that down below, and also just in the video itself. But yeah, that's really question number one, is the difference between pre-sale versus resale. And hopefully this gives you guys a better explanation.
Yeah. Really big question that we get asked a lot is to do with deposits and pre-sales. And how it differs from a resale property.
Yeah, and I mean, it is so drastically different, right? When you're dealing with resales, you're going to be used to a 5% deposit, usually at subject removal or around that time frame. Whereas with pre-sales, the deposit schedule, and it's a schedule, is actually set by the developer. And so a lot of the times you're dealing with some form of like, whatever, $1,000 or $10,000. We see that pretty often, like when you write the contract, and then the remaining 10% of that due at the rescission period, and then maybe 5% when they get the financing condition,
or exactly, like that.
And then 5% usually 6 months afterwards or something. So a lot of the times you'll see this schedule of roughly about, say, a year and a half, depending on how early on in the project you are. But it's really common to see some form of, I'd say, 10 to 20% total deposit, but over a period of time. I mean, we have seen some pretty good incentives lately, but
for sure. I feel like right now there's been a lot of like like 10% deposit schedules.
Yeah.
And I mean, there's been cases where we've seen as low as 5%, but that's, I would say, pretty uncommon. Yeah. Same with like seeing as high as 25%, but again, pretty uncommon.
And more of a luxury product.
Exactly,
yeah. 25%.
So I think typically what you're going to see is that 10, 15, or 20% deposit schedule. And as Mariko mentioned, kind of over that period of time, can be within 3 months, 6 months, a year, or if say the project is 5 to 8 years down the line, then you might have a little bit longer of a deposit schedule going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that with the deposits too, like the schedule itself is one thing, and again, it is set by the developer, so it's not like the buyer sets that. Mm-hmm. But I think that it's also interesting because in resale, the deposit always gets held by the buyer's agent's brokerage and trust.
Exactly.
Whereas with pre-sales, it's actually all through the developer's lawyer in trust.
Yeah.
So that is also a really important point, is like usually it's by form of bank draft, but just knowing who holds that and how it gets dealt with and the schedule in which it's done is a big question that comes up with pre-sales.
Yeah, and I think the other one thing to note is that usually this deposit schedule is mentioned in the contract. So you know this kind of going in. Typically, you're even kind of notified before you write the contract what their plan is, but then
it's realistic.
Exactly, but then it is defined within the contract itself. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the next big one that we have are taxes. So as Mariko mentioned, there is a 5% GST that's included in pre-sale. So I think that's really one of the big differences between pre-sale and resale.
Definitely. And so the two taxes that we're generally dealing with in real estate as a whole, whether that be pre-sale or resale, is GST and property transfer tax. So one of the key defining ways that you can figure out whether you're buying a pre-sale is whether or not GST is applicable. GST is applicable for pre-sale, so that's 5% added on top of the purchase price. But for resales, you don't have to pay GST on the property purchase price. Yeah. So GST, I mean, it's no chump change. If you're dealing with a property that's $800,000, 5% of that is an extra $40K. Mm-hmm. So your all-in cost, not even factoring in the property transfer tax, is $840,000. Yeah. That is a decent amount of money.
Definitely not.
It's not cheap.
Not cheap. Yeah.
But it is something that you can blend into your mortgage. And so if that's something that you are considering, you can talk to your mortgage broker about that. It's not like PTT where you have to pay it lump sum at completion, but just keep in mind any taxes that you are trying to incorporate into your mortgage, you're also paying added interest on that. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's really a big one with pre-sales. There are GST rebates. They're at a much lower amount than what you're mostly going to see in the Greater Vancouver area, but it's something for you to check out if you do apply. And then property transfer tax is really the next big one.
Yeah, and there are differences with that one in terms of the exemptions for pre-sale. Mm-hmm. So in pre-sales, it's called the newly built home property transfer tax exemption. So with this one, the exemption itself is up to a purchase price of $750,000. And then as well, the next really big thing is that you don't actually have to be a first-time home buyer. For this one, you can be a repeat purchaser and have bought homes before that.
Yeah, and that's really different compared to resale, because the property transfer tax exemption for resales, you have to be a first-time home buyer, and it actually has to be under $500K. So with the newly built home exemption, that's why you'll see a lot of people really trying to hold to that $750K number, because yes, they're paying GST, but they'll get that PTT exemption, which is really that break to help. But there are also partial exemptions as well. So all the way sliding scale up to $800K. So from that $750K mark, the number keeps getting smaller and smaller until you get to a $0 exemption up to the $800K mark. Yeah. So something to be aware of. But yeah, those are really the key differences when it comes to pre-sale for taxes.
Yeah, for sure. So the next frequently asked question that comes up a lot is to do with the rescission periods in pre-sales and whether or not people need to lock in financing during the 7-day rescission period.
Yeah, and for those of you that don't know, the rescission period is a 7-day long period once you get an accepted offer in pre-sales that you have to really do your due diligence. And so a lot of the times this due diligence is relating to reviewing disclosure documents, which are basically the documents that explain the development and what it's going to look like. Bylaws, strata plan.
Yeah, like can you have pets? If you have a dog, you want to know that you can have your dog in the building.
Very
sort
important.
Of things like that. Yeah.
But that's what that rescission period is there for, and the disclosure statements is one of those things that you do. A lot of people are also going to start their conversations with mortgage brokers as well. But I think that a lot of the reason why people choose pre-sales is because you don't necessarily need to lock in your financing right now. You don't actually need to have your financing or your final down payment funds or your final like closing costs until the actual completion day,
which could be 3, 5, 8 years. It could be a year if it's a little bit sooner, but it's usually typically down the line a bit.
Yeah, depending on the development. So for example, like we have a lot of clients that maybe right now can't necessarily qualify for financing for some reason, whether that be
student.
Exactly, like they're a student, they know that they're going to have a job that is very solid income in a couple years, but they want to lock in at today's market rate right now. They'll buy a pre-sale knowing that they have the deposit to be able to afford it, but then won't have to necessarily start their payments, their mortgage payments, any kind of further payments outside of the deposit until the completion day. And then they qualify at that point in time. So long story short, you don't actually need to qualify for financing during the rescission period, but it's nice to, at least in our opinion, talk to a mortgage broker. And when you are talking to a mortgage broker, I mean, if you can lock in those numbers, oftentimes you can get things like firm approval. So maybe that's a blanket appraisal, maybe that be a long-term rate hold. But that's a whole other video that we could talk about.
It gets a little bit more complex than that.
Very complicated. But you don't necessarily have to be doing that at that point in time. You can just run the hypothetical numbers with your mortgage broker and then really finalize everything once you're kind of in that maybe like 3 to 4 month out from the completion period.
So as we just mentioned, completion can be longer. It can be 1, 3, 5, 8 years down the road. If it is a move-in ready home, it could be within a couple months, but that's a really big difference in terms of pre-sale versus resale as well that we get asked a lot about is how completions work in pre-sale properties.
Definitely. And I think like the reason why Kiyomi says like, oh, it could be this year, it could be this year, it could be this year, is because the sales process is also long as well, right? Are you getting in as soon as like they start selling the first day of sales, or are you already a year and a half into sales where there may be only a year out from the project actually being built, right? So a lot of the times, like the low-rise developments, I mean, they take in the realm of 2 to 3 years. Whereas the high-rise developments, I mean, generally it's like 5, 8, but sometimes for these master plan communities, we're working into the 10-year marks depending on how they lay the foundation. So yes, it matters the type of development that you're buying. And whether, you know, it's a master plan community, whether it's a condo, whether it's a townhouse, whether they've broken ground, but also at what point are they through the sales or the construction process. But moving on more to like the contractual way of how completions work in pre-sale, I mean, it's very different than resale.
When it comes to resale contracts, you will have that set completion and possession date written into the contract, whereas in pre-sale contracts, you do have a completion date written into the contract, but it's usually more of a range. So if the project is estimated for spring 2024, in the contract you might see something like March, the estimated completion date is from March 1st, 2024 to June 1st, 2024. So yeah, you have a little bit more of a range versus an exact date because there are subject to delays when it comes to pre-sale properties.
Exactly. And on the note of delays, like in the contracts for pre-sales, there's a number of different key dates or terms. So one of them is called the outside date. So this is basically the drop dead date for the latest time that the developer thinks that they're going to have it done. It's generally plus 1 year from that estimate. So in Kiyomi's example, she's talking about March to June 2024. The outside date would probably be something like June 2025. But in addition to the outside date, there's also additional clauses that generally say that the developer has an option to extend the outside date. A lot of the times this is in the realm of, you know, 120 to 240 days, somewhere around there, in additional time. But they also have another clause that talks about things like acts of God. So we've seen this a lot. I mean, delays for like labor, appliances, shortages and stuff.
An earthquake or something and like the building is damaged. Obviously, that's
out of control.
Much bigger. And then during COVID, we started to see COVID clauses coming into that as well.
Yeah, exactly. By delay of pandemic. So it's just important to know that with, you know, completions, the general theme is here that with pre-sales, it's not a set day.
Yeah.
This day is subject to change. Don't bank on this. If anything, bank on it being delayed.
Yeah.
Because that happens more often than not.
Yeah.
And so that's really what we're seeing with regards to these completions. I think that the last thing that we get asked with regards to completions for pre-sales is like, how much notice do they have to give me for that final completion notice?
Yeah.
And most of the time, it is quite literally only 2 weeks. So 10 business days where they can say, oh yeah, we have an idea that it's going to be June 2024 and we're all the way at, you know, call it April 2024. And it's like May 2024 comes along and it's just like still waiting.
No idea,
and then finally the developer will be like, okay, here's your final completion notice. So until you're within that 2 week or 10 business day window, you have no guarantees that that's actually going to be your completion date.
Yeah.
So yeah, just be aware that completion dates are not a set thing, that notice is generally pretty last minute for the final completion, that delays are subject to happen, and that the completion dates are just estimates when it comes to pre-sales.
Yeah, the big key word with completion dates and pre-sales is it's an estimate. So last but not least, the final frequently asked question we're going to be covering in this video has to do with assignments. And so the big question that comes around assignments is what happens if I can't get financing and I need to sell the unit that I purchased?
Yeah, and this is specifically selling the unit that you purchased prior to the completion day. So an assignment of contract is basically, say that I'm the original buyer and I bought it from the developer and June 2024 is that completion day, and come fall of 2023, I'm like, oh my gosh, I just lost my job. I can't buy this property anymore, or I come under financial duress, like something happens where I'm like, I cannot purchase this and I know I'm not going to be able to qualify for financing. I could try and assign my contract, which means I, as the original buyer, before it even completes, before I even own it, I'm going to try and assign it to buyer B, which is in this situation, Kiyomi. So Kiyomi is going to take over my contract. I'm going to assign it to her. She's going to complete on it, and she's going to reimburse me for my deposits that I've paid and any lift, any appreciation from the original contract price from when I purchased it to what is now market value at today's date. So that is what an assignment of contract is. Kiyomi knows this better than anyone as a presale expert, that you should not bank on assignments.
No, definitely not. There's a lot of rules that come with assignments. Mostly because it became a thing where people were just buying pre-sales to essentially flip them, assign them, and make money off them. So that became a really big thing. Does still happen obviously now, but developers have tried to kind of
crack down.
Yeah, tighten the rules a little bit so this doesn't happen as often. So the big ones is that there's usually an assignment fee. So if you do decide to assign it, you can see anywhere between like 2 to 5%, or they might give you like a lump sum being like it's $2,500 to assign your contract that you have to pay to the developer when you do that. The other big one is that it's going to be up to the developer's approval. So not only do you have to get them to approve to let you assign the property, but also when you do find a buyer, they have to approve the contract and then the buyer itself. Yeah. So those are a really big one as well. And lastly, there's usually advertising restrictions as well. So the developer will set these advertising restrictions where, for example, with resale properties, you usually list your property on the MLS, which is a large database for realtors to look at the properties, as well as it being linked to public websites. Whereas in pre-sales, the developers sometimes won't let you list on the MLS, or they won't let you put anything on a public website. So you're really relying kind of on your database, if you're working with a realtor, their database, and it's more of an exclusive listing than a public listing for these assignments.
Definitely. And last but not least, with regards to assignments, a lot of the times there will be a restriction as to whether or not the developer has sold all of their units. So it's very normal that if the developer has not sold all of their units or has not sold a substantial portion of the market value of the building, say like 90 to 95% of the building, that they won't let you assign, just because they don't want to cannibalize their own inventory. And even further from that, they also just don't want a bunch of people to start dumping their property as well, because it can often tarnish their reputation.
Exactly. It might make the building look bad, being like, why are all these people selling out of this development?
Exactly, before it's built. So oftentimes they'll hold a wait list, so maybe 2 or 3 units even can just be assigned at a time, let alone on the MLS, just assigned at a time. So I mean, It's obviously a very complicated process. There's a lot of hurdles in terms of the market needing to go up substantially just because there is that assignment fee that you'll have to pay, and then also realtor commissions on the sale that you'll have to pay. There is the cannibalization of the listings, wanting the developers' units to sell first, or a substantial amount of them, and then generally the wait list. And then there's also just the advertising portion of things where it's a little bit more difficult to advertise an assignment of contract.
So I think really the overall takeaway is that assignments just are not a guarantee. I really wouldn't bank on it. There's just, you know, it's not going to be written into the contract that you're 100% allowed to assignment. So just keep that in mind. Usually there's a good chance that you will be able to, but it just, you really can never know.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that going back to our point about financing, you know, even if you're not planning on locking in financing during the rescission period, it's still a really good idea to just connect with a mortgage broker during that period of time, so that you know that during that period, which is the rescission, that you have the ability to back out, that you know beyond a reasonable doubt that whether it be based on hard numbers or hypothetical numbers, that you are going to be able to purchase this pre-sale, just so that you don't need to be in a panic state later on and bank on assignments just because you can't always bank on them.
Yeah, totally. And so assignments, obviously a very complex issue. There's a lot of paperwork involved. So it's really important to work with realtors that know assignments and really understand it, because there's a lot of realtors that don't know how to work with assignments.
Exactly. Even ones that know how to do pre-sales, a lot of pre-sale realtors still won't deal with assignments. So it's very niche. And very complex, and as Kiyomi said, completely different paperwork. So if you are thinking about assignments too, I actually have another video on assignments, which I will leave a link to, so that you guys can check that out. And then obviously if you have any other questions about assignments or pre-sales in general, you can always leave it down in the comments or reach out to us directly.
So those are some of the big frequently asked questions that we get from clients when it comes to pre-sale properties, but obviously there are many more that come along with it.
A plethora of questions.
So many questions.
Pre-sales, it's never ending. It is a very complex process, so don't be too hard on yourself if it is a big learning curve, because that's completely normal.
There are realtors that don't even know much about pre-sales. They won't even touch them because
they literally won't touch pre-sales
because they're so complex.
So definitely make sure to check out our blog for the more comprehensive version of this video. You can check out bridgewellgroup.ca, which is our website, and go to the blog section or the pre-sale section, and you will see the pre-sale FAQs that we've kind of provided for you guys in written form. That is a lot more detailed and extensive, and something that you can constantly refer back to very easily.
Yeah, we'll leave a link in the description below as well, so you guys can easily find it too.
In the meantime, we hope that you enjoyed this video and that it was helpful. If you want a part 2 of this, or you have any more questions that you'd like answered, definitely leave them down in the comments below, and we'll consider making another video, and of course we will answer. Make sure to like and subscribe so that you get more videos moving forward. As we said, my name is Mariko and this is Kiyomi. We are both residential realtors with Bridgewell Real Estate Group. We're based out of the Greater Vancouver area, and so that's really our bread and butter. And we deal with both resale and pre-sale. So if you're trying to figure out which one is the best option for you, and you're looking in the areas that we service, then definitely feel free to reach out to us anytime. And thank you so much for watching, everybody. Have a great day.
See ya.